The story of the United States does not truly begin in 1776. It begins earlier, in the smoke, blood, and global chaos of a much larger war. By the middle of the 18th century, the world's great empires were locked in a struggle that stretched far beyond Europe. From the forests of North America to the coasts of India, Britain and France fought what historians would later call the 7 Years' War, the first truly global conflict. When the cannons finally fell silent in 1763, Britain stood victorious. France was crushed. Its colonial ambitions in North America lay in ruins, and the British Empire emerged as the most powerful force on Earth. Britain now controlled vast territories across the eastern half of North America. Its navy ruled the oceans. Its merchants dominated nearly a third of all European trade. From the outside, this looked like absolute triumph. But empires, like ships, can sink even while flying victory flags. Because beneath the surface, Britain was drowning in debt. The cost of victory. Winning the 7 Years' War had come at a staggering price. By 1763, Britain's national debt had reached £133 million, a sum so enormous it threatened the stability of the entire economy. Interest payments alone drained the treasury year after year. Parliament was forced into painful decisions. Even the Royal Navy, the very institution that had secured Britain's global dominance, was not spared. Its budget fell sharply, from nearly £7 million in 1762 to £2.8 million just years later, and eventually down to £1.5 million by 1769. Britain had won the war, but now struggled to afford the peace. Taxes at home were already crushing British citizens. There was little room left to squeeze more money from the public without risking unrest. Yet the empire faced another problem, one that would soon ignite a second fire across the Atlantic. The frontier explodes. No sooner had the 7 Years' War ended than violence erupted again in North America. In the Great Lakes region, a coalition of Native American nations rose in armed resistance against expanding colonial settlements. These communities had seen their lands threatened and their agreements ignored. To prevent further bloodshed, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763. It banned colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving the territory for native nations, with exceptions only for licensed fur traders. The intention was stability. The result was outrage. American colonists, especially frontier settlers, felt betrayed. They had fought and sacrificed during the war, and now believed Britain was denying them the rewards of victory. To enforce the proclamation, Britain stationed more troops in North America, at a cost of £320,000 per year. Debt rose even higher, and soon, London began looking toward the colonies for answers. A king, a parliament, and a dangerous idea. King George III now faced a critical question. How could Britain escape its financial crisis? With domestic taxation already stretched to the limit, the answer seemed obvious. The American colonies should help pay. After all, Britain argued, its army protected them from foreign enemies and frontier violence. Was it not fair that they contribute to imperial expenses? But the colonies no longer thought like loyal subjects. They were distant from London. They governed themselves locally, and many believed Parliament had no right to tax them without representation. The first test came in 1764, the Sugar Act, the first spark. The Sugar Act placed taxes on sugar, molasses, and other imported goods, especially those purchased from non-British sources. It also introduced strict enforcement. Merchant ships had to post bonds. Detailed cargo records were required. Royal Navy officers were allowed to search and seize suspected vessels. To British officials, this was routine regulation. To American merchants, it was economic warfare. Traders flooded London with complaints, arguing the act violated long-standing agreements guaranteeing free trade. Smuggling, once quietly tolerated, was now aggressively punished. Yet the Sugar Act was only the beginning. The Stamp Act, a colonial explosion. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. It required colonists to purchase official stamps for legal documents, newspapers, licenses, even playing cards. In Britain, a similar tax funded nearly half of the government's budget. Parliament expected the colonies to accept it quietly. Instead, the colonies erupted. Protests swept through cities and towns. Tax collectors were harassed, threatened, and sometimes attacked. Stamps were burned in the streets. For the first time, resistance united colonies across regional lines. Faced with mass unrest, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. But Britain could not afford to appear weak. We still rule. On the same day the Stamp Act was repealed, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. Its message was blunt. Parliament had full authority to make laws for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. Soon after, new taxes followed under the Townshend Acts, targeting imports like tea, glass, and paper. In response, colonial leaders organised boycotts of British goods. Among them was Samuel Adams, who warned that Parliament was demanding obedience without consent. A new slogan echoed through the colonies: "No taxation without representation." What began as financial protest was becoming a constitutional crisis. Boston, the heart of rebellion. No city embodied resistance more than Boston. Tensions between civilians and British soldiers simmered daily. On March 5, 1770, the situation exploded. A crowd of colonists confronted a small group of British troops. Insults turned to violence. Stones and debris filled the air. In the chaos, shots were fired. 5 civilians lay dead. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Patriot leaders used it as propaganda, portraying Britain as a brutal occupier. Trust collapsed completely. 4 years later, Parliament responded with force. From protest to war. The coercive acts punished Massachusetts directly. Boston's port was closed. Local self-government was restricted. British troops were quartered among civilians. Rather than calming the colonies, the measures radicalized them. By February 1775, Britain officially declared Massachusetts in rebellion. General Thomas Gage was ordered to crush resistance by arresting rebel leaders and seizing weapons. On April 19th, British troops marched toward Concord. At Lexington Green, colonial militia stood waiting. A single gunshot, fired by no one knows who, shattered the peace. War had begun. Lexington, Concord, and a new reality. British troops advanced, but resistance spread rapidly. Militia units attacked from forests and stone walls. By the time British forces retreated to Boston, they had suffered heavy losses. The myth of British invincibility was broken. Soon after, colonial forces fortified positions near Boston, including Breed's Hill. When British troops attacked, they won the ground, but at terrible cost. The Battle of Bunker Hill shocked London. The Empire had won, yet nearly lost an army doing so. Even King George III now lost patience. A rebellion declared. In August 1775, the king issued the Proclamation of Rebellion. American ships were banned from British ports. Colonial assets were frozen. The conflict hardened. Loyalists, colonists still faithful to the crown, faced intimidation and exile. Many fled to Canada or Britain. Britain sent massive reinforcements. 20,000 regular troops. Thousands of German auxiliaries, often called Hessians. Meanwhile, colonial leaders sent one last appeal, the Olive Branch Petition. It was ignored. Independence was coming. New York, fog, and false confidence. In 1776, British forces shifted focus to New York. William Howe defeated Washington's army in a series of battles. Only fog and luck allowed the Americans to escape across the East River. Britain now held New York City. Victory seemed inevitable. But Britain underestimated time, distance, and determination. A global war on too many fronts. As the conflict dragged on, France entered the war. Spain followed. The American rebellion had become a world war. British forces were stretched thin, defending the Caribbean, fighting in Europe, holding Gibraltar under siege. Resources drained away from America. Still, Britain pressed on. The Southern Gamble. In 1780, British strategy shifted south. Charleston fell after a brutal siege, capturing an entire American army. General Charles Cornwallis pushed through the Carolinas. But every victory came at a cost. At Guilford Courthouse, Britain won, yet lost a quarter of its men. Cornwallis marched into Virginia, exhausted and undersupplied. He chose Yorktown. It would be his last mistake. Yorktown, the end of an empire's dream. In September 1781, a French fleet blocked the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis was trapped. American and French forces laid siege. Day by day, British defences collapsed. On October 19, 1781, over 8,000 British soldiers surrendered. The war was effectively over. Britain could not continue. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized the United States as a sovereign nation. Britain ceded vast lands east of the Mississippi. An empire had retreated, quietly, reluctantly. The torch of global power began to pass. The American Revolution was not just a colonial uprising. It was the moment Britain learned that even empires have limits, and the moment America stepped onto the world stage.